What we have done now is part one of the indisputable forensic evidence about the World Trade Center. The second part will be the indisputable forensic evidence on the Pentagon, and Barbara will lead you through that. I would like to introduce Barbara Honegger, who has served in high-level positions in the US government, including in the White House, as Policy Analyst, Special Assistant to the President, and Director of Attorney General's Law Review at the Department of Justice. For a decade and a half, Mrs. Honegger then served as a senior military affairs journalist at the Naval Postgraduate School, the premier science, technology, and national security affairs graduate research university of the United States, Department of Defense. She wrote the book October Surprise on the deep story behind the Iran side on the Iran-Contra scandal, subsequently confirmed by formally classified documents, led to a full subpoena-power congressional reinvestigation funded at the level of the 9/11 Commission. Since 9/11, Ms. Honegger has been a leading investigative researcher, journalist, and author on the events of the day, speaking at conferences in USA, Europe, and Canada. She's a board member and officer of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, researched and produced video documentary Behind the Smoke Curtain on the Pentagon attack and the 9/11 Museum walking tour. Barbara, it's an honor to invite you to give your view on what happened in the Pentagon, because a lot of people don't know that part of the whole story.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention and for being here. I have a tremendous amount of extremely important information, and I'm going to go very quickly. So buckle down and pay attention. The title of my talk is The Parallels Between the World Trade Center and the Pentagon Evidence and Why It Really Matters. Very quickly, setting the scene. So what you're seeing here is an aerial view of the Pentagon on the morning of, well, as it was on the morning of 9/11. And what you're looking at is called the west side of the Pentagon. It's about 3 football fields in length. The official story says that a huge 757 hit that side of the building going at over 550 miles an hour. This is a graphic. That red dot is where the official story says that 757 hit at almost 9:38 in the morning. This is a graphic representation of what the official story would have you believe. Now note where the plane would have to be. The height of the Pentagon is only 71 feet. The whole fuselage length of the plane is 155 feet, over twice the height of the building. And this is what you're supposed to believe. Now in this presentation, I'm not going to talk about the planes. And that may surprise some of my colleagues, but you're going to learn why. Architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth has been so successful because in our movement, because of its laser focus on pre-placed explosives, as you know, and incendiaries, and very important, because they ignore the planes at the World Trade Center towers. They don't talk about the planes. They don't need to talk about the planes because they don't matter. They're just the cover story. We now understand that. Despite there being just as much potential controversy, which I'm not going to go into, but you might want to ask me a question afterwards about it, over the World Trade Center planes just as much as there is about the plane or planes at the Pentagon. They just don't go there. The main message of my presentation is that to be successful when our movement finally turns its full attention to the Pentagon, which it is about to do, I believe it's critical for our success that the movement does exactly the same thing at the Pentagon. We must ignore the plane. The plane doesn't matter, as you will see in this presentation, any more than it does at the World Trade Center 1 or 2. And why? Because, as we will demonstrate here, pre-placed explosives are the key to both what really happened at the World Trade Center towers and World Trade Center 7, as well as at the Pentagon. Not only the key to what happened, but the key to who did it. First, however, I'm going to talk about the proof of the cover-up briefly, the evidence that the government, our government, the United States government, knows that pre-placed explosives are the true story at both the World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon on 9/11. From the very beginning, the FBI's, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's official code name for its entire 9/11 investigation, which is still ongoing to this day, was Pent-Bomb. That stands for Pentagon, Pen, Twin Towers, TT, and bombing. This cover article in Time magazine, the director of the FBI himself, yes, that's the same Robert Mueller, he confirmed, quote, "The Strategic Intelligence Operations Center of the FBI filled to capacity on September 11th and remained that way," this is his quote in Time magazine, "through Pent-Bomb." And he says that's our FBI's cryptonym, code name for Pentagon, Twin Towers, and bombing. And now you're going to see, compare, look for your own eyes, what happened at the Pentagon on 9/11 after the attack and right after the Oklahoma City bombing. And we know that the Oklahoma City bombing was due to pre-placed bombs or explosives inside the building. The Ryder truck bomb was just the cover story. And the FBI's code name for the Oklahoma City bombing investigation was Oak Bomb. And we all know it was about bombs, pre-placed bombs. So, the FBI's code name for the entire 9/11 investigation, including the Pentagon, is Pent-Bomb. They actually lead with Pent, not Twin Towers. So it's not just pre-placed explosives, and very few people in our movement know this, but massive pre-plane impact explosions happened at both the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on 9/11. There were massive deep base explosions that went off in both Twin Towers before the plane impacts in either tower. 14 seconds before World Trade Center 1 was hit, way up above, deep basement explosion, 17 seconds before a plane hit way up above World Trade Center 2. Both places. And that is in the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 inquiries official World Trade Center petition for a grand jury in New York City, which has been accepted by the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. It is featured in our petition. The official Pentagon story claims that the building damage, all of it, was from a plane impact that happened at almost 9:38 in the morning. And yet, just like at the World Trade Center, massive explosions before plane impacts, at 9:30 at the Pentagon, almost 8 minutes earlier, when the official story claims that Flight 77, or whatever plane it was still miles and miles and miles outside of Washington, D.C. There were massive inside the building explosions at the Pentagon by April Gallup's desk. She's a critical witness. I call her the Willie Rodriguez of the Pentagon. This is a diagram of where April Gallup's desk was, over in Wedge 2, and the alleged impact point, almost 8 minutes later, in an entirely different wedge and about 150 feet further to the right or the south. And here's April Gallup on the lawn. And by the way, this massive explosion stopped her wristwatch. And she's kept that wristwatch and she's secured that wristwatch for official investigations in the future. And confirming the initial massive explosion inside the Pentagon before there was any plane anywhere close to the building, the White House's own internal timeline that has now been released by our National Archives in Washington, D.C., says that the Pentagon was attacked at 9:30, exactly the time of the stop of April Gallup's watch, from a massive inside explosion. No plane at all. This inside explosion was also immediately communicated to the White House. Even Secretary of Transportation Mineta talked about it. There were wide reports of explosions and explosives throughout the entire Pentagon chain of command, starting with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest ranking active duty military officer in the United States military. He said, the smell of cordite was overwhelming. This is in his autobiography, without hesitation. And there were many other witnesses to the smell of cordite, which is very similar to gunpowder, but an advanced form of that, very cool burning explosive. Hundreds raced down the hall. I've interviewed this person, this Army Fort Monmouth witness, Michael Nielsen. Hundreds raced past him down the hall, shouting, "It's a bomb, bombs went off, it's a bomb, it's a bomb, get out, it's a bomb." Now this is very, very important. There are Pentagon witnesses to primary inside the building explosions. By primary, I mean not as a result of any impact of anything, including sequences of controlled demolition charges with precisely the language like the famous video where he says, "Oh, they were going off like firecrackers, bum, 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 bum."
Floor by floor instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated, if they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
I can't be specific. I looked and I could see the corner, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, "How fast?" I go, "Like firecrackers."
So here's the quote. "It sounded like a series of explosions going off inside the Pentagon on 9/11. It sounded like a series of bombs exploding, similar to like firecrackers when you light them and you just get that series going off." That's a Pentagon witness. No plane involved. The official Pentagon story claims that a plane penetrated only to the inside of the third of 5 rings in. This is a graphic of the Pentagon, and you can see the E ring on the outside. The third ring is the C ring. That's where the alleged exit hole of a plane was, which it couldn't have been. And the B and the A rings are further in towards the center of the courtyard. However, there was massive fire, destruction, and deaths in the 2 innermost rings, beyond where the official story that the government wants you to believe in the Pentagon itself, the furthest that there was any damage on 9/11. That is a lie. Also, the outer E-ring windows, inside the building, witnesses who survived the attack, those windows first bowed outwards from an internal pressure wave, then came back in. And you can actually see the result of this here. If you look carefully, these windows, all of this internal office debris is being forced out of the windows from the inside pressure wave out. Pentagon concrete even turned to mush from intense temperatures. And there was iron. Similar to World Trade Center towers. The Pentagon concrete and the World Trade Center concrete, similar massively high temperatures, molten concrete. There were inside explosions and outside explosions. I refer you online to my video. It's called Behind the Smoke Curtain. So these are just other examples of massive inside and outside the building explosions. This one is extremely important. This is clearly this explosion where the orange box is, and that's from the Pentagon Building Performance Report. It's in the second ring in, and it's a massive explosion from the base up, from the first floor up. And even the Pentagon's own Building Performance Report authors, who are all experienced engineers, have said explicitly that this was probably due to an independent, that is, having nothing to do with an impact of anything, as fire would at most have collapsed the second floor downward, but it was a massive upward thrust. This is one of the stopped Pentagon clocks. These stopped Pentagon clocks from massive explosions on the inside of the building in one case, and even on the heliport tower, which is outside the building about 100 feet. They're stopped way earlier than 9:37 and 46 seconds, which is the alleged time of an impact of a plane. I'm going to play this for you because you're going to now hear the massive explosion, a kaboom, a 2-part explosion, just before this famous collapse of the outer wall that is supposed to allegedly be due to a plane impact. Now you're going to hear this massive explosion.
And once again, on the left-hand side of your screen, you are looking at the Tower 2, the first one. This is all New York now.
Michael, if you can hear me, we just heard another explosion down at the Pentagon building. We just heard another loud explosion down at the Pentagon building just seconds ago.
That's our Audrey Barnes, who is standing nearby the Pentagon, saying they heard a second explosion. Audrey, did you see anything, since these other attacks have been aerial? Did you see anything flying overhead just before this explosion?
We can't see exactly where the source of the explosion was, but you could hear it very clearly with a loud boom. And I'm looking for another plume of smoke. I don't see anything right now. It might be still in that same general area where the fire is burning right now, but you could clearly hear another loud explosion.
Retired Air Force officer Peter Tiradera wrote a book called 9/11 Coup Against America. He's an expert in this. He says the damage pattern for the collapse of the wall shows the signature of controlled demolition. Some of the pre-placed explosives inside the Pentagon were even reported on the day of 9/11 itself by the Pentagon officially as having been targeted to take out specific functions in the Naval Command Center. This graphic is from the Washington Post immediately after 9/11, showing, and it's called the targeted ones, and it's showing the takeout or the attempted takeout by pre-placed explosives of the Naval Command Center's intelligence cell, naval intelligence. The instant reaction of the official story's alleged sole survivor of the Naval Command Center 2 rings into the building, it had to have been a bomb. It must have been a bomb. And the rescue teams who went into the Naval Command Center called it a bombed-out office space, which is exactly what it was. These were pre-placed explosives. And you've heard, of course, of the famous slogan, "Follow the money." And many of you know that the day before 9/11, that both Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and his comptroller of the Pentagon, was the chief financial officer of the Pentagon, Dov Zakheim, both publicly acknowledged that the Pentagon was allegedly missing, could not find $2.3 trillion. And there were pre-placed explosives by April Gallup's desk in the Army administrative area where civilians were trying to track that money. They were killed. And not only were they killed, but according to Catherine Austin Fitz, that there were backup records at World Trade Center 7, and we know what happened to World Trade Center 7. I refer you to the 9/11 10th anniversary Toronto hearings that were mentioned by Professor Neil Serrett. We were both speakers there. I highly recommend that you order this extremely important book. This is from the 10th anniversary conference. It was held in, of course, Toronto, Canada. It's called the 9/11 Toronto Hearings. My chapter 13 is on the evidence of pre-placed explosives at the Pentagon, and it is published in this historic document. So the real story at the Pentagon is the same. The story that matters is the same as at the World Trade Center. That is a surprising finding. And that is pre-placed inside explosives with plane approaches or impacts as just the mere cover cause. So why does this really matter? It matters because in either place, World Trade Center or Pentagon, we all know, no foreign terrorist could possibly have placed explosives, especially inside the Pentagon, which is the most secure building on the planet. It wouldn't have been Al-Qaeda, it wouldn't have been bin Laden, it wouldn't have been the Saudis, it would have been the Pentagon. Page 51, the famous quote from the Project for New American Century, also known as PNAC Manifesto, called Rebuilding America's Defenses, by the way, published exactly a year before 9/11. The process of US military transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. So now I'm going to end my presentation by focusing on why the Pentagon is so critical to what happened on 9/11 and especially everything that's happened afterwards. Only the Pentagon attack, not the World Trade Center, not Shanksville, only the Pentagon attack literally made 9/11 into the new Pearl Harbor that the Project for New American Century neocon manifesto authors, signatories, and principles called for exactly a year before 9/11. And only the Pentagon attack on an iconic national military facility like the original Pearl Harbor provided the pretext for the war on terror, and you have to underline the word war. The World Trade Center towers were commercial civilian buildings. Don't forget, World Trade Center 1 had already been attacked by a bomb on the B2 level in a single column that killed 5 or 6 people and seriously injured 1,000 in 1993. And that was handled perfectly fine by the civilian courts, as was the Oklahoma City bombing. But the people who really did 9/11, who pre-planted explosives inside the Pentagon and the World Trade Center towers and World Trade Center 7, they didn't want the civilian courts to be involved. They wanted the military courts to be involved. This is literally the day of 9/11. Pentagon spokesperson with "We are at war" behind him, they already had that thing to roll out. So it was the Pentagon attack, the attack on a national iconic military facility that made the event into a new Pearl Harbor. The Project for New American Century Manifesto. This is a list. It's hard to read, but if you get behind the smoke curtain, you will be able to read this. Blow it up on the screen. The Project for New American Century Manifesto that called for the new Pearl Harbor, which was the attack on the Pentagon on 9/11. These are all of the people who signed that document as either principals or signatories. And this is the proof with their names, as well as their positions in the George W. Bush Cheney administration. They took over all the levers of power and secrecy in order to plan, to carry out, and cover up the inside attacks of 9/11. These new Pearl Harbor signatories and key participants included all of these war hawks that you're familiar with: Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, Jeb Bush, Dov Zakheim, Zalmay Khalilzad, Stephen Cambone, I. Lewis Libby, and John Bolton, who just got fired. 9/11 Commissioner Bob Kerrey himself said that 9/11 is, quote, a conspiracy that was 30 years in the making. Well, do the math. That would go to the early 1970s. In the early 1970s, to my knowledge anyway, there was no Al-Qaeda. David Rockefeller, who built the Twin Towers, quote, this is from his memoirs: "We are on the verge of a global transformation, and all we need is the right major crisis, and the nations of the world will accept their new world order." President George H.W. Bush, who's known to be a Rockefeller man, on September 11th of 1991, quote, "What is at stake is a big idea, a new world order. A new world order can emerge. Now we can see a new world order coming into view. This is a very real prospect of a new world order." Nicholas Rockefeller to film producer Aaron Russo, and this is on YouTube, you can see it. In September of 2000, as the Project for New American Century Manifesto calling for a new Pearl Harbor that happened exactly a year later on September 11, 2001, Nicholas Rockefeller, quote, "There's going to be an event a year from now. And out of that event, we're going to invade Afghanistan so we can run pipelines through the Caspian Sea, so we can go into Iraq, and so we can take the oil and establish bases in the Middle East, and to make the Middle East part of the New World Order." Nicholas also told Russo that if Russo joined them, Russo would be spared the police state measures, i.e. the new Department of Homeland Security that was created on the pretext of who attacked America on 9/11, the lie, will be spared the police state measures that would be imposed on the rest of the American public after, quote, the event happened. And everyone knows about the Project for New American Century plan for New Pearl Harbor. Goes back to at least 1991, according to General Wesley Clark. And you can hear him saying this, or see him saying this, on YouTube.
What happened at 9/11 is we didn't have a strategy, we didn't have bipartisan agreement, we didn't have American understanding of it, and we had instead a policy coup in this country. A coup. A policy coup. Some hard-nosed people took over the direction of American policy, and they never bothered to inform the rest of us. I went through the Pentagon 10 days after 9/11. I couldn't stay away from Mother Army. I went back there to see Don Rumsfeld. I went downstairs, I was leaving the Pentagon, and an officer from the Joint Staff called me into his office and said, I want you to know, he said, "Sir, we're going to attack Iraq." And I said, "Why?" He said, "We don't know." He said, I said, "Well, did they tie Saddam to 9/11? He said, "No." And then I came back to the Pentagon about 6 weeks later. I saw the same officer. I said, why haven't we attacked Iraq? We still going to attack Iraq? He said, "Oh, sir," he says, "it's worse than that." He said, he pulled up a piece of paper off his desk. He said, "I just got this memo from the Secretary of Defense's office that says we're going to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years. We're going to start with Iraq, and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. I sat on this information for a long time, for about 6 or 8 months. I was so stunned by this I couldn't begin to talk about it. And I couldn't believe it would really be true, but that's actually what happened. These people took control of the policy in the United States. And I realized then, it came back to me, a 1991 meeting I had with Paul Wolfowitz. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, and you could name a half dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down, make it under our control. It went back to those comments in 1991. Now, did anybody ever tell you that? Was there a national dialogue on this? Did senators and congressmen stand up and denounce this plan? Was there a full-fledged American debate on it? Absolutely not. And there still isn't.
Steve Pazinick, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State to 3 presidents of the United States, has gone public. That's on YouTube as well. He said, "I'm willing to name under oath the top general on Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz's Pentagon staff who told him that 9/11 was a false flag attack." Quote, "They ran the attacks," the general said, "of Wolfowitz, Deputy Secretary of Defense, Vice President Cheney, Cheney's top aide Stephen Hadley, Elliott Abrams, Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush in the White House, among others." The 9/11 scenario was not without precedent, which happens to be, by the way, the title of Keenan Hamilton, the co-chairman of the 9/11 Commission's book. They call it Without Precedent. They want you to believe that nothing in the United States had ever happened, anything like 9/11. That is false, and they know it's false. The skies over the entire United States, just as on 9/11, were completely cleared once before. In a NORAD exercise, and remember that on the morning of 9/11, NORAD was conducting, and so were many other agencies, NORAD was conducting multiple counterterrorism emergency response exercises and war games, many of them on the actual scenario of the actual attacks, according to the official story, on the morning of 9/11. So the skies over the entire United States were totally cleared once before in a NORAD exercise way back in 1961 called Sky Shield 2. And you can read about this in the Air Force's own book about 9/11 called Air War Over America. I highly recommend that you buy it. It's a little bit pricey. You can get it for about $75 on Amazon.com. So, Sky Shield 2 in October 1961 cleared the entire skies before the NORAD exercise, which was done in conjunction with the Canadian Air Force. And it was under the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Lemnitzer. It's the same general who signed the Operation Northwoods plan that proposed a false flag terror attack to President Kennedy, who said, "No, I don't want anything to do with it." But Lemnitzer signed it on behalf of all of the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of the top military officers of all of the United States military services, proposing a false flag terror attacks, including using military planes pretending to be civilian airliners, and even proposing, as one of its scenarios, killing US civilians to create a pretext for invading another country. In Lemnitzer's Sky Shield 2 exercise of October 1961, this is in the Air Force's own book on 9/11, Air War Over America, get it and read it, the skies over the entire United States mainland were cleared of all civilian planes, and Canada's planes played red team attackers, and US military planes played blue team defenders. So in that exercise, in 1961, the Canadian planes pretended to be Soviet nuclear bombers. Parallel NORAD exercises were ongoing on 9/11. The 9/11 plot was therefore a convergence of Lemnitzer's Sky Shield 2 and Operation Northwoods. And what did Lemnitzer do? He went on to become the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and the architect of the Operation Gladio false flag terror attacks throughout Europe during the Cold War to frame and blame the political left. So what's the bottom line? Everything you're told by the government about 9/11, both at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, is a lie. And the real story at both is pre-placed explosives. In conclusion, the Pentagon attacked itself on 9/11. Pentagon civilian officials at the highest levels, I've just named them for you, the signatories and principals who signed and put their names exactly a year before 9/11 to the call for a new Pearl Harbor in the Project for New American Century Manifesto. These Pentagon highest level civilian officials planned, masterminded, and carried out the attacks with pre-placed explosives, using planes as the military-controlled cover cost at both the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And this insider plot converged the key elements of both the Operation Gladio false flag terror attack, architect General Lyman Lemnitzer's NORAD Sky Shield II exercise of 1961, and his Operation Northwoods plan. 9/11 was America's false flag Gladio terror attack on itself, with the goal of terrorizing the citizens of the United States and the world into accepting the new American century, aka the New World Order. The real perpetrators, bottom line, are still at large. They are armed. They are extremely dangerous. They are hiding behind layers of lies and patsies, and they must be brought to justice. Thank you.
And guess who's going to drive that action for justice? And we're going to help her.